Hey people, and welcome to this fifth and last part of this series about drum set tuning. In the previous episodes we talked about tuning the snare drum, the bass drum and the tom-toms, and now we will look at the whole drum set and look at how the different instruments correspond to one another. We look at resonance, we look at snare buzz, we look at the intervals between the toms, and we also talk about muffling and how to tune old drum heads. So let's start right away after I tell you again that we record everything with just one single microphone mounted on the top of the camera, so everything you hear is just how the drums sound in this room. Now there's a very important question. We know how to tune each drum, but we don't just play one drum, we play a whole drum set. So how should the drums correspond to one another in the whole drum set? Of course, this again depends on your goal, your personal taste, and the style of music you play, because in every style of music there are different aesthetics. In heavy metal, for example, you want to have very big intervals, very clear articulation, so you have a very low bass drum sound and a very high snare drum sound. Very high toms and very low toms. In jazz, this range is a little bit more narrow, so bass drum and snare drum might have a smaller interval than in heavy metal music, and also the toms are a little more narrow in the range of sounds they have. But this is just a rule of thumb. Again, it depends on your personal goal, and you should always have a goal to strive towards, so you know when you have failed or when you have achieved it. So don't just try out things, but set a goal for yourself. Have a sound in mind, an interval you want to get, and then try to reach this goal. And maybe it just doesn't sound good, the idea you had in your head, but at least you learn something along the way. This helps you achieve an awareness of the possibilities you have with your drum set. It's very important to know the range of your drum set, to know how the drums sound with different heads and different tunings. You have to know the highest and the lowest tunings possible with your drums. I will tell you why this is so important in a minute, but before that I want to address one thing. Because when talking about tuning the toms, there's one topic that often arises, and that's tuning the toms to specific pitches. I'll be honest, I don't do this. I haven't practiced this, and I only want to tell you about things I know how to do. I have practiced and I do myself. And also, I don't know many drummers who actually do this. I know that there are some guys doing this in the studio, and that's exactly where it's a good idea. Sometimes in the studio, something does not sound quite right, and then in the studio you have the time to maybe check the tuning of the toms. Maybe it's not tuned to the root of the song, and so it does not correspond well with some other instruments playing in a certain section. In the studio you do have the time, which you don't have live. You can go into all the details. So it's a good idea to know how to do this, but I would not recommend doing this live. Also because, for two reasons. One is that not every song has the same key. So once you tune your toms to a certain pitch or to a certain interval, that might sound great in one song but not in the other. And also this would add one really big item to our already very long list of responsibilities as drummers. Because once you tune your toms to a certain pitch, you have to make sure that they stay in tune. And if you don't tune to a certain pitch, if the toms detune, that's not so dramatic. If you tune to a specific key, to specific chords, if the toms detune, you will hear that. And I, as drummer, I like to focus on my main responsibilities, and I don't want to worry about retuning the toms between each song. So I like to find a tuning. I like to find a tuning that sounds well over the microphone. The sound engineer is happy, that fits with the room I'm playing in, great intervals between the toms, and just leave it at that. I personally don't use tuning aids, but if you want to tune your toms to a certain discrete pitch, then the TuneBot is probably a pretty good idea. That's a tuner for the drums. From my experience, tuning the toms to discrete pitches is less important than having good intervals between the toms. Even though you don't have a discrete pitch, you can clearly hear the differences of pitch between the toms. And while we are talking about intervals, there's a great tip I recently got from a colleague of mine. Usually the differences between sizes of the toms are linear. Except for the 13-inch tom, we have 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. So those are the sizes usually available. And if you want to have a deep and fat and big sound, you would go for the two biggest drums, right? But that's not always a good idea. If you have a pretty even tuning on all the drums, skipping one of the sizes might usually give you an interval of a major fifth. So if you play the two drums closest to each other, you might have a major third. But if you skip one size, you usually have a major fifth. And that's just a bigger sound. So you have kind of a power chord on the toms if you do this. So if you want to have a big, impressive sound, don't go for 14 and 16 inch, go for 12 and 16 inch, or even for 10 and 14 inch. Try it out, it's amazing, it sounds great. Since I learned this, I tried to avoid playing two adjoining toms at once. But back to tuning. As I said, it's very important to know the range of your drum. It's important to know the highest tuning, the lowest tuning, and how your drum sounds with different heads and in different tunings. Because then you know how to tune it to correspond with the other drums. And my suggestion is you start by having all the drums in the same tuning. So you know the range of tuning, and you pick a point in this range. Maybe you want a little bit more than average, a little higher. Then you tune every drum, each drum, to this position in its personal range of possibilities. And then you should have a pretty even starting position. But this is just a starting point, because we have to keep one thing in mind. When physical bodies get bigger in a linear way, like 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 inch toms, the volume inside the drum does not increase linearly. The bigger the shell gets, the smaller the increases of the volume of air inside the drum. This is why smaller drums have a bigger natural difference in pitch than bigger drums. So a 12 and a 10-inch tom have a bigger interval naturally than 14 and 16-inch toms. So we have to adjust for that. So having all drums on the same position within their range does not give us equal intervals. Maybe the floor tom, the differences between the 14 and 16-inch is too small, and you want to tune the 16-inch tom even lower, but it doesn't go any lower because the head is completely loose. This is why I would suggest starting with the floor tom, the tom where it's pretty possible to go into the extremes, so extremely low. And a 10-inch tom or even an 8-inch tom can go very, very high, so you don't have to worry about that. You won't go to the extremes there, I'm pretty sure. So start with the tom, with the floor tom, and then work your way up. And as I said, it's just a starting point with the equal tuning for all toms, and then adjust for that, starting with the lowest tom. This is why when we only have two toms, we have to make a compromise between having all the range of sounds from the highest to the lowest and having a nice interval between the two toms. So having a very high-pitched 10-inch tom and a very low-tuned 16-inch tom might give you the whole range, but the fill-ins over the toms won't sound great because you have a much too large interval. You see many drummers with two tom-toms playing 13 and 16-inch or 12 and 16-inch. I think that's a pretty good idea, pretty good compromise. So find a compromise between the shell sizes and the tuning. If you only have a 10-inch and a 16-inch tom, I would suggest tuning the 16-inch tom a little higher than average and the 10-inch tom a little lower than average to adjust for this big difference in shell size. And there's another kind of interval which affects our sound to a large degree, and that's the interval between the two heads of each drum. So the interval between the batter head and the reso head. So you could again start by trying to get the same interval between the two heads of each drum. But again, that's just a starting point, as we have this different relation from shell size to volume, so each drum might work best with a different interval. But just try it out. This method corresponds well with trying to get the heads to a specific pitch, as then you can clearly decide which interval you have and which interval you want to have. So maybe you want to have a major third, and that's a little bit easier to hear or to decide if each head has a specific discrete pitch. Also, I have once heard that having a great interval, a great chord between all the reso heads of the toms should give you a pretty great sound, pretty great intervals between the drums. I've not tried this, maybe you try it. Just try out different intervals for each toms and find out what works for you. Again, it's all about trying out for yourself and knowing the range of possibilities, and then you can be flexible and creative with all the methods I showed you. One problem which sometimes arises is that of unwanted resonances or sustain. So your drum has a great sound, but it rings just a little bit too long. Of course, you can always go to the old duct tape, but I really prefer solving this with tuning. So try everything you have in your toolbox first. So in your toolbox concerning tuning. So you don't even need the tape. But if you have some resonances, some sustain you want to get rid of, you can take some tape and you do this, put it on here. A long time I've wondered why you make this little kink in here, but that's pretty simple. If you take a flexible material like this tape and you put it on there, it just adds mass to the membrane, and that doesn't stop the resonance. Now you have a pendulum which sucks up the resonances. So try it with the tape and then without the tape. You just get rid of just a little bit of the high frequencies. Of course, you have those little moon gel thingies. They cut away a lot of the high frequencies. But this is also a problem. They get dirty quick and you might just lose them. And if they're dirty, they rattle. So maybe you just use something like this. The Mini Muff from Germany. Interesting little device. Just put this clamp on the hoop. And this is a very soft material and just cuts away just a little bit of the frequencies. Not too harsh. I really like the sound of it. Let's see. Just dampened it just a little bit. Interesting device. Also, you can always use the old felt strip. This is usually used with the bass drum. So you put it underneath the head and you put the head on this. And one trick I learned from Benny Greb is you take a little bit of cotton or light material. I just took something from here and put it inside the tom. So this way you have a physical noise gate. Because you hit the drum, the cotton rises up and then sinks down on the head. So you have the full stroke on there and then just a little bit of dampening to cut a little bit of the sustain. If on the other hand you want a little bit more sustain, of course you can always tune to a more resonant tuning. But also you have some gadgets like those booty shakers from T-Nod Products. The floor tom stands in here, so the sustain will get a little bit longer because of this foam. It can resonate more. It's not dampened by the floor. So we compare this without and with the booty shakers. at least where I'm sitting, I'm getting much more sustain, a little bit more bass frequency. So I really like those. Also, some drummers play a rag tom resting on a snare stand. I don't like that because I find that it cuts away very much of the sustain, and I don't like a very dry and short rag tom. So there's also a device, also by TNR products, just those little foam L's you put on here with a Velcro tape, and your snare or your rag tom can rest in here and also ring a little bit longer. While we're at it, please don't tighten this clamp so much that you can take your snare away together with the snare stand, because this can result in unwanted pressure on the shell, and this way you also dampen the snare. It's just like holding it in your hands, holding it tight. Of course, it won't ring as long as when you loosen it a little bit. So what I like to do is I tighten it until I notice that the snare is rattling in there, and I can lift the snare with the stand, but it still rattles a little bit in there. One question I get asked a lot is, how can you quickly change the tuning, maybe between two songs? The first thing I want to give you is just practice tuning. The more you practice, the more familiar you get with your drums, with your drum set, the better you know what you have to do to change the tuning towards your desired goal. Because with two drum keys you can change the tuning quickly. Of course you can't always change the bottom hats, but if you know what tuning your bottom hats are in, you know what to do with the top hats. Also, some manufacturers offer certain drums or certain hoops where you can change the tuning of the whole drum very quickly. So you just turn one screw and the whole hoop goes down or up. I know DW offers something like this, but then you have to purchase the whole drum or the whole system for this. There are other methods, and of course you can always detune, you can always go lower and shorter. Just take your favorite towel and just place it on the drum. So what was this is now this. Much more quiet, much more dry, and less overtones. Of course, same thing with the toms. But that's very radical, of course. Remember all the muffling devices I showed you before? Maybe you just want to start with muffled drums, and if you then want more overtones, you just take them off. That's of course very quickly. So maybe you start with loosening one screw on the snare drum, or let's say the three facing towards you. So you have a dry snare sound to begin with. Like this. And if you then want a higher, more sustained tone, you just increase the tension. I think that was very quick. But I always prefer solving those problems by playing, the way you play. Of course, with a snare drum you can always play a little bit more to the edge. You probably know that you have much more overtones there. Same thing with the toms. And this is at least perceived much more sustained. And also, I have a great tip for you. You can play softer. Why softer? Well, when you play amplified with microphones or you record something, the drums on the PA system or on the recording will have a certain volume, no matter how you play. The sound engineer will always achieve the same volume. And if you play quieter, if you play softer, you have much more sustain relative to attack compared to when you play loud. If you play very loud, you have a sharp attack and a very sharp decay and less sustain. And you have even less sustain if you play soft, but much more less attack. And if then the sound engineer increases the volume, then you have much more sustain in relation to your attack. Now let me address one very important topic. Now we have put so much effort into tuning our drums and we're really satisfied with the way they're sounding, but we already know it won't last long. They will detune. Well, how can we stop this? We really can't stop it, but there are some things you can do to help prevent it a little bit. And the first thing is, of course, the proper way to get your head in tune. So really center the drum head, stretch the drum head, very important. So get stretch all you can so it won't stretch when you play and won't detune when you play. That's what the guitar players do when they put new strings on. They also stretch the guitar strings so they won't stretch when they play. That's the first thing to do. Also, when you're tuning, always tune up. So if you want to have one screw lower, then you tune a little bit lower than you want to and then up again. So always come to your desired tone from under the tone. The idea is very simple. The material is just twisted in the opposite direction. So maybe this won't prevent detuning for long, but it's just a little part of it. Also good ear training to always come to your desired tone from under the tone. And there are, of course, some interesting devices like these lug locks by Gibraltar. Very simple. You just put them over the head of the screw with a little bit of pressure, and then they prevent the screw from loosening. You can use them a few times, but they also won't prevent the drum from detuning totally, but it also helps prevent it a little bit. I usually use them with a snare drum at the point where I play my rim shots, because that's usually the first screw to loosen, because there's just the most action happening, and that's of course the first screw to loosen then. And I use those, and I use another trick. I just tune those screws a little bit higher than I want to, because I know they will detune anyway, so I overcompensate for that. And it has another benefit: the higher the tension, the longer it takes for the screw to loosen, of course. And the last tip I can give you is, of course, just play a little bit softer. Especially on the snare drum, it's usually a good idea not to hit it so hard, because the bigger drums like the floor toms and the bass drum usually are perceived not as loud as the high-pitched snare drum. So playing it softer in order to have it stay in tune longer may also result in just a little more balanced sound of the whole drum kit. So those are the tips I can give you, but of course we can't totally stop the drums from detuning. And if you look at the pros, they all retune their drums between the songs. That's totally okay. Just like guitarists retuning their guitars between the songs, we can do this as well. There's really no shame in that. Let's talk about snare buzz, meaning the rattling of the snare wires if you hit another drum. Doesn't matter which drum, you always hear a little bit of the snare wires. What can you do about it? Well, let me tell you at first, you don't have to do anything about it. You can just deal with it. You can accept it, that it is a living and breathing instrument. I think that's quite nice that you hear that there's actually all these drums in one room and they talk to each other. And sometimes it's even a good thing, because sometimes you have a very dry bass drum and the snare rattling just gives a little bit of sustain to the bass drum. And you just hear that there's a real bass drum and a real snare drum in the room. I think that's very, very nice to hear. But if it's too annoying, there are some things you can do, of course. But don't detune any drums. Don't sacrifice the sound of any drum because you want to get rid of the snare buzz. At first, try a different position for the other drums. Maybe the rag tom is the one causing most of the snare buzz, so you try to find a better position where it doesn't cause that much snare buzz. Or you insert something, a barrier between the two drums. Maybe just a little bit of foam could be enough to get rid of some of the snare buzz. Of course, you can experiment with the tension of your snare wires, but that again would mean sacrificing your snare sound. But maybe you're lucky and the one tom that's causing most of the snare buzz is also the tom you're playing least in this particular song or this particular recording. Then it would be fair to detune this a little bit so you don't have that that much snare bass, because the snare is usually played much more than the toms. One question I get asked a lot also is how to tune old drum heads. Well, you don't always have the money for new drum heads, or maybe just not the possibility to get new drum heads. There are some possibilities to tune old drum heads, but I think it's well invested money to get some new ones. But if you don't have the opportunity, I think the first thing you should do is just treat the old head like a new one. So all the screws off, freshly reseat the drum head on the center of the drum head and tune it just like a new one. It won't be as good, but it would certainly be better than than if you just stuck with the way it is and just try to retune it. What you always can do with older drum heads, you can go a little bit higher. The lower tunings are much more difficult because there is some tension in the drum head, and the more tighter the drum head is, the better you can balance this tension. So maybe you tune your whole drum set just a little bit higher and you probably get a little bit better tone out of it. You can also try heating your drum head with a hair dryer, and this is a trial and error thing, but maybe you're lucky and you hit the right temperature and the right spot, so the drum head expands and reseats itself. And speaking of reseating, you can also blow inside the air hole, in the venting hole. And this, what this achieves is that the drum head gets lifted up and then reseats itself on the bearing edge. So those are just a few tips on how to tune old drum heads. But still, I really think it's well invested money to get some new ones, and you can always recycle the old ones, because aluminum, most of the rings are aluminum, is worth some money still. You can just save all your old drum heads and then turn them into money later on. And also you can just use the whole head for different purposes. You can cut out cut a ring out of it, a dampening ring for the toms or the snare drum. You can cut the straps for the snare wires, or you just use it as a diffuser for lighting, for flashlights, for film and photography, or use it as a frisbee, or I don't know. I'm pretty sure you have some ideas. We can collect all the ideas in the comments below how to use old drum heads. So here we are now at the end of this 5-part series. Again, it's up to you. Pick those methods and tricks you need for the quest for your perfect drum sound, and then you have to practice them. And on your way, I'm sure you will pick up a few new methods and tricks. Maybe you come up with your own. And if so, please let me know in the comments below so we can share our knowledge. If you enjoyed this series, please hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Take care. Goodbye.